Keith.
Hey, Jeff. Hello, good morning, and welcome everyone to the Raschkowan series. We'll give everybody just a minute or two to get settled in. We have almost 150 registrants today, which is really exciting for this important topic. As always, we want to thank our partners. The webinar is generously sponsored by the Norman Raschkowan Foundation and presented in partnership with our friends at McGill University's International Center for Youth Gambling and High-Risk Behaviors. I'm joined today, of course, by Dr. Jeff Derevensky, not only the founder of the center, a longtime advocate, researcher, clinician in youth gambling issues, a member of the NCPG Board of Directors, winner of awards too numerous to count. I will, just with my thanks to Jeff, I'll turn it over to him in a second. He'll introduce Dr. Michael Wall. But again, we just wanted to thank you again, Jeff, for your leadership in the field on youth gambling, on problem gambling and responsible gambling in general, and for your long time just friendship and service. So with that, I'm so pleased to welcome and thank my friend, Dr. Jeff Derevensky, who will take over with the rest of the webinar.
Well, thanks, Keith, and thanks for all those positive comments. Again, we're very pleased to offer the Raschkowan webinar series in collaboration with the NCPG, and that's been really quite rewarding for everyone. So today we're very pleased to have a fellow Canadian, Dr. Michael Wall, who's a professor of psychology and director of the Carleton University Gambling Laboratory. And their laboratory focuses on factors that predict disordered gambling, facilitators of responsible gambling, and means to overcome barriers to behavioral change. My colleague and friend, Dr. Michael Wall, has published over 160 peer-reviewed papers. He's been the recipient of multiple awards as well. And we're really happy to have him present on the changing face of responsible gambling. He's done a lot of work in the area of positive play, and really he's going to teach us all how to harness it. So it's my great pleasure to welcome my colleague, Dr. Michael Wall.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you all can see my slides. All right. So first, I want to thank Jeff and Lynette at the International Center for Youth Gambling Problems and High-Risk Behaviors, as well as NCPG, for inviting me to speak to all of you virtually here today. But if you will allow me a moment to say a special hello and thank you to Jeff. I wanted to take this opportunity in this public space to thank you for all that you've done for the field of gambling studies and all that you've done for me personally over the course of my career. I'm honored to be in your sphere. I'm honored to call you a friend. I'm here because this intellectual giant allowed me to stand on his shoulders. So thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
One more thing before I start. It's becoming normative for researchers to disclose relationships that they've had or have with the gambling industry. It's important to note that any engagement with the gambling industry, any engagement that I've had with the gambling industry has always been subject to a clause of non-interference. If I'm consulting, they can't interfere in terms of how I conduct my research or how I analyze the data, interpret the data, write up the data. If you'd like to read more about my thoughts about how to effectively and productively collaborate with the industry in an open and transparent manner, please read the two papers that I've referenced at the bottom of the slide. Okay, now down to business. To best understand the changing face and future of responsible gambling, which I'll henceforth refer to as RG, we need to jump into our proverbial time machine and scan the past. So for the vast majority of human history, the idea of gambling providers assisting those who gamble to do so within his or her means was a foreign concept. The only real motive was the profit motive. This began to change in the late 1990s and early 2000s with the rapid expansion of legalized gambling. Key stakeholders like government, policymakers identified gambling-related harms as a public health concern. Due to a confluence of factors, gambling operators felt compelled to teach their players about responsible gaming or gambling and how to do it effectively. Of course, those factors, or at least one of those factors, was the rise of what has been called corporate social responsibility, or the corporate social responsibility concept. Specifically, there was a growing belief, not just in the gambling industry, that companies have a moral responsibility to their customers and society at large. Now, I hate to be cynical here, but corporate social responsibility initiatives are not purely altruistic. Companies quickly learned that, that it helps maintain, when you engage in corporate social responsibility, that it helps maintain a pro-social image to potential customers. It helps maintain and grow the customer base. Take, for example, Dove and the Love the Skin You're In campaign that everybody seemed to love. However, Dove, remember, Dove is also owned by Unilever, who owns Axe body spray, that produces commercials that are in contradiction with perhaps the Dove campaign. Additionally, in controversial industries like the gaming industry, companies must include harm minimization to help satisfy government, policymakers, and the public. And also in the gambling industry in particular, there was and is a growing understanding that social responsibility is needed to grow and maintain a long-term customer base. That is, there's growing understanding that it's better for the industry if you have a broad base of players that are playing recreationally than having most of their profits or a lot of their profits being generated by a small portion of the population that has a high correlation with disordered gambling symptomatology. So now with that said, I think that it's also important to note that in the early days, corporate social responsibility was not based in sound empirical research, and particularly in the gaming industry. It was based on gut feelings and intuitions, what I call the Kenny Rogers philosophy of responsible gaming. So hopefully you're now maybe singing the gambler song in your head. What is the Kenny Rogers philosophy of responsible gaming? It's intuition. It's, you know, like Kenny Rogers said, you got to know when to hold them, got to know when to walk away, know when to run. Again, hopefully that song's not in your head while I'm talking about the rest of my talk. A game changer for responsible gaming for RG was the Reno model, which really popularized the term responsible gambling. Now people refer to as responsible gaming or healthy play or positive play, but perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself right now. According to the Reno model, the gambling industry holds a duty of care, but ultimately it's the player's responsibility to play within their means. Hence came the term responsible gambling, and love it or not, it took over the airwaves. And researchers began to do what they do best, conduct research, at first in the laboratory and then moving on in the field. And what did they find? Among other things, we came to a greater understanding that players tend to misunderstand the odds of winning. They misunderstand how gambling games work. So for example, here you have a picture of a conveyor belt a lot of people think that slot machines work kind of like a conveyor belt where you have a bunch of losses and some small wins and maybe that big win you see at the end. And every time you put in a quarter, the win gets closer. People tend to misunderstand that. In fact, every time you play, the odds get reset. The odds never change. So if you think about sort of a bag of marbles, that when you put in your quarter and you're taking out a marble or an outcome, before you play again, that marble has to get put back in and then it's shaken up again, okay? People tend not to understand this. And they hold illusionary beliefs about one's ability to maximize outcomes, their ability to win. In fact, my introduction to the field of gambling studies was based on a question that I had when my then PhD advisor one night said, "Hey, Michael, why don't we go to the West Edmonton Mall where there's a casino? Let's go to the casino." I said, "Okay." And the next day we had this tradition of having tea in the morning and, you know, discussing psychology. And I turned to Mike Enzel and I said, "You know, Mike, why do people blow on dice before throwing them?" And that led us to look into the notion of a personal possession of luck. So some people believe that they are personally lucky. By definition, luck is a random event that occurs in the cosmos, but some people believe that they're personally lucky, and then they can impart whatever luck they believe that they possess onto the dice, for example, by blowing on it. And that increases at least their perceived chance of winning. And least you think that any of this stuff is really silly, I'd ask you how many of you either today or in the last week went to an elevator, pressed the elevator button, it then turned red, and then you continued pressing it, right? You think that it's coming any faster? No. Do you think that, like, by pressing it, you know, faster, that there's maybe some dude at the bottom of the elevator going, "Oh, Jeff is really needing to get to floor 12. I'm going to move this elevator faster." It just doesn't work that way. But what ends up happening is this failure to understand the odds and these notions of personal luck lead people to believe that persistence pays off, right? That if they just play longer, that they will eventually win money. And this is why we see people holding slot machines, putting their chair up against it, because God forbid they should walk away, go to the bathroom, and somebody takes their win. It doesn't work like that, okay? Now, based in part on some of this research, the gambling industry jumped in with both feet, sometimes with the assistance of academics like myself, but often on their own or with marketing firms to create tools and programs like GameSense, which were meant to help gamblers play within their financial and time means. Now, if the primary objective is to minimize harm, let's examine a little bit about how these programs are doing, how these tools are working, right? Do they actually minimize harm? Okay. At the onset, responsible gambling programs tried to educate players with static messages in the casino, so posters around the casino. Research showed that players often didn't pay attention to those signs. And if they did, they didn't recall the message well afterwards. As such, other avenues were sought. And a large body of literature suggests that many of the tools that were created do have RG utility. So, for example, one of my favorite studies that I was a part of is I helped create an animation that explains how slot machines work. If you're interested at some point, not right now, after the talk, feel free to go to YouTube and Google slot machines, what every player needs to know, and you'll see this animation that we created that explains how slot machines work, using that conveyor belt that I spoke to you about earlier, as well as the bag of marbles example. And what did we find? What we did is we actually went to the local casino in Ottawa and recruited people before they entered the casino, and had them either watch the animation or a control video. And what we found is that those who watched the animation, that the amount of erroneous cognitions, erroneous beliefs that they have about play decreased. And that was maintained over a 30-day period. We called them back 30 days later. We've also, not just myself, but others in the field of gambling studies have also tested the utility of pop-up messages. So that is when they're playing slot machines, that they get a message on the slot machine that either tells them, gives them responsible gambling information, or perhaps allows them to set a limit on how much they're willing to spend. So here you see a screenshot of a former student of mine playing in my virtual reality casino in my laboratory, where players can set a limit on how much they want to spend. You see, it says, how many credits do you want to spend? They enter in the limit. And then when they hit that limit, then another message comes up that says, hey, you've reached that limit. Would you like to continue playing or not? And at least in this particular study, what we found is that players who used this tool were much more likely to adhere to a money limit than those who didn't adhere, who didn't use the tool. Okay, so, and this is not just from my lab, there's many labs around the world now that are testing the utility of responsible gambling tools. And by and large, what do they find? Well, there seems to be reasonable evidence that responsible gambling RG tools do help minimize harm. So that is that they help to players to consider how much time and money they want to spend at a casino or gambling, and that this can help minimize or reduce the amount of excessive play, that is perhaps spending beyond their means. And also the research shows that most players think that these responsible gambling tools and programs work. However, what research from my laboratory, as well as others, have found is that only about 1 to 10% of players actually use these tools that are offered to them. And the question is, why? And so for the rest of the talk, what I'm going to be doing is giving you some of my thoughts about why the uptake of these responsible gaming tools, RG tools, is so low, and what might we do to help increase the numbers, okay? Especially since, again, we know that these RG tools work. So once again, there's been a proliferation of RG tools that have been created, RG ad campaigns, RG information centers, RG awareness weeks, and now months. This is what I call the more is better approach. Look at how much stuff we've done. This is so great. Look at all these tools we have. Look at all of our stuff. But the evaluation component has been absent. I've also noticed a tendency for providers to hear what researchers say about what works and what doesn't work to minimize gambling-related harms, but then not necessarily incorporate experts in the field of gambling studies into the development of RG messaging and RG programming. In fact, I've been approached numerous times by operators saying, hey, we've got this program or this tool or this commercial. What are your thoughts about it? But then it's often too late to make any significant changes, if it's even possible to make any changes at all, because too much investment is already made in it. There was once where I was approached to give my feedback about a commercial, but the commercial was already made. So there wasn't much, if anything, that could be done at that point. And there was some significant problems with that commercial. particularly with the language used. And often the language that we use in RG misses the mark or even undermines responsible gaming. And what do I mean by this? Let's take a closer look. Does language matter? Yes. As anyone who has been married or in an intimate relationship, or any relationship for that matter, knows language matters. We spend our entire lives bumping up against people with our exteriors, using words to communicate, yet not truly understanding how they interpret those words until something goes terribly wrong. How many times have you uttered the words, "That's not what I meant"? We often fail to understand that our intentions with our language, that the language we use, isn't always how those words are interpreted. And the words we use have consequences for both beliefs and behaviors. Let's take some words that are used in prevention as well as intervention in the field of gambling studies. Let's take so here we have gambler, budget, disorder, addict, gaming, gambling, responsible gambling, or responsible gaming, limit. Let's take self-exclusion for a moment. In much of the world, operators have what are called voluntary self-exclusion programs that allow players to ban themselves from the casino. Might the low uptake be a product of the name? No one wants to be excluded. In fact, there's a large body of literature in social psychology that shows exclusion is psychologically and physiologically painful. And people inherently know this and want to avoid being excluded. So perhaps just simply using the term voluntary self-exclusion program is making people avoid it. Okay, maybe a better term would be play break. Okay, so let's give you another example. I see that there are a couple of questions. Should we be taking some questions now, Keith, Jeff, or would you prefer waiting until the end? I'm not really monitoring. I just saw a little pop-up bubble.
I think it would be best to go through it, and then we'll leave some time at the end for the questions.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good. So let's take another page out of my ancestral field of studies. That is the field that I was trained, social psychology. In a famous study by Loftus and Palmer, participants watched a series of film clips of car collisions where they were asked a series of questions, one of which concerned the speed of the moving car. Okay. For one group, the question was, how fast was the car going when it smashed into the second? For the other group, the verb smashed was replaced with hit. A week later, two groups were asked another series of questions, one of which was, did you see broken glass? Twice the number of participants whose original question about speed included the word smashed reported glass, compared to those whose original question included hit. Interestingly, there was no broken glass in the film clip. Now, why am I telling you this? Oh, and by the way, when asked about how fast the car was going, people who were told that the cars smashed each other said that the cars were going faster than when they were told that the cars hit each other. Why am I telling you this? Almost any object can be introduced into a set of facts, particularly if it's consistent with the way a person typically understands a given situation. In the context of car accidents, people typically associate accidents with broken glass. In the context of gambling, the trick is finding the appropriate wording and phrasing that will lead the player to associate responsible gaming with a satisfying, fun, and positive experience. I don't want to flog a dead horse here, but I do think that it's important to understand the changing face and where the face needs to change in RG. Again, language matters. Now that we've set the stage, let's ponder a bit about what is happening in the RG world and ask some questions. Are we unintentionally creating exclusions? Certain words may result in people thinking, hey, this is not for me. Let's take the term responsible gambling or responsible gaming, right? Are they saying, hey, I'm responsible, I don't need this? Are we considering language changes? So language change over time. Words that were innocuous 5 years ago have become a pejorative now. So should we be using terms like gambler or somebody who gambles, or should we be talking about an addict or somebody who's living with addiction? This can matter. Are we considering mindsets? Players in one state of mind might interpret messages differently than another, right? That we are using terms that, for example, the move from responsible gambling to gaming, right? How might that be affecting the player, right? Are they now seeing it as just a game? It's not gambling anymore. Could this potentially be problematic? Are we critical enough with the language that we are using? So sometimes you'll notice in this talk, I keep bouncing back and forth between gambler and player, right? Increasingly, people are using the term player as opposed to gambler because, often players associate gambler with having a gambling problem. But gambling isn't merely playing a game. They're not just players. And so are we perhaps shooting ourselves in the RG foot by using the term player as opposed to gambler? These are all things I want you to be thinking about as, again, I move forward in the latter half of this talk. Let's do a little bit more of a deep dive into a fundamental problem with, at least that I see in terms of RG. Traditionally, for many players, RG has been seen as being aimed at people with gambling problems. Even though RG is more about prevention of gambling problems than intervention, the focus of RG messaging has been geared towards problems and the problems people may face. Consequently, many people might think, hey, this isn't for me, this is for others. Again, traditionally, responsible gaming has used sort of a stick approach. If you don't do this, bad things are going to happen. This has resulted in many players saying, again, this isn't for me. They run away from RG tools because the stick is only for bad people, for people who are playing problematically, right? It's not for me. Now, I don't mean to throw any jurisdiction or group under the bus here. I've done some searching about on RG posters and messaging a lot over the past little while. Here's just a smattering that I think really hammers home my message about why some of the messaging about RG might be problematic, okay? Here we see 888 admit it. I find this very problematic, right? Is this something that people are going to feel warm and fuzzy about and want to use? Often things like when the fun stops, stop, right? Well, again, I think that this is targeting a small portion of the population, only about depending on the prevalence study, only about 1 to 2% of players have problems. Now, of course, we need to be keenly aware of those individuals who are having problems and putting things in place to help them. But RG is by and large about prevention, helping players not develop gambling related problems. But the messaging around RG seems to be directed at the 1% as opposed to the 99%. So should we be then surprised that 99% of players tend to balk from using RG tools? Recently, my colleagues and I have proposed a different way of doing RG, what we call the positive play approach. At the heart of this is the maintenance and facilitation of healthy beliefs and behaviors, not avoiding bad ones. Things like do this and have a better experience. What I'm going to be telling you now in this slide is what's at the heart of what we consider the positive play approach. Number one, simple and actionable messages. People respond more enthusiastically to positive activities and tools that they can use to prevent health problems, okay? That there's been research that has found that players generate more website click-throughs when information was presented as a positive and simple actionable point than messages that are more negative and general information like what is problem gambling. Positive messaging that is concrete. Messages that are positive, concrete, and simple are likely to be more effective than traditional negative problem gambling and problem prevention focused messaging. This is one of the reasons why we received such positive feedback about the animation that I showed to you earlier. It's cognitively simple, it's concrete, it tells people what gambling is, what it is not, and how you can gamble in ways that will minimize gambling related harms. And number three, urgency. Messages that imply that there's urgency, okay? Instills a sense of urgency with messaging such as, have you enrolled in, insert the RG program here yet? Why wait to have a more satisfying play experience, okay? Why does the positive play approach work, okay? It works because positive messaging and imagery are simply more persuasive than negative. Negative imagery makes people want to run away, look away, okay? Positive messages are also more relevant to all players than our negative messaging. So, within the context of the positive play approach, my colleagues and I developed what we call the positive play scale. The positive play scale is made up of two related beliefs. So number one is personal responsibility. That is the extent to which players believe they should take ownership of their gambling behavior. And gambling literacy, the extent to which a player has an accurate understanding about the nature of gambling and how games work. We also have, as part of the positive play scale, two positive behaviors. One of them is being honest and in control of your gambling, the extent to which players are honest about with others about their gambling behavior and feel in control of their behavior. And pre-commitment. That is the extent to which players consider how much money and time they should spend gambling. I'm heartened that many jurisdictions around the world have begun to frame RG in terms of positive play and using the positive play approach. My colleagues and I have conducted numerous positive play studies in which we've administered the positive play scale to players within a jurisdiction. What we're finding, okay, here's just a synthesis of some of our findings in 4 different countries, but we've conducted this in many countries around the world, is that what we find is that by and large, a large percentage of players are scoring high in positive play in relation to personal responsibility, in terms of their honesty and control, but perhaps not so much in terms of their pre-commitment behaviors as well as gambling literacy. And why is that important? Well, this allows for jurisdictions to have a more tailored approach to their responsible gambling messaging. So a jurisdiction, perhaps in the United States, that is seeing, hey, we're doing quite well in terms of our players taking personal responsibility and being honest about their play, but they just don't seem to understand how the game works. They can then tailor positive messaging around gambling literacy to help increase the extent to which players in their jurisdiction are playing positively. Okay. Now, of course, you might be asking, well, what can people do? Okay, what can we do to advance positive play? And here are some of my thoughts and some data that are associated. Providers should be considering how positive their players are, and of course, keeping an eye on the rates of disordered gambling. But what is lost is, again, the vast majority of players, the 99% of players that are by and large playing positively. They need to consider what these players might want. And what players want, what people tend to want, is often information about themselves and information about how their play relates to the behavior of others. People love finding out about information about themselves. It's one of the reasons why those what Harry Potter character are you quizzes that often you see are so popular. People want to know how they are doing and how they're doing relative to others. It's why leaderboards are so intriguing to people. This is the social proof or social norms approach. A powerful way to influence people is by communicating what most other people do. In fact, there's been a number of studies about this, but one that's particularly salient to me is that in the UK, business tax returns increased by about 18% when told that 95% of businesses file on time. Okay, how might this translate to positive play? Well, perhaps you say to players, did you know that 92% of players report having a positive play experience when they consider how much money they are willing to lose before they play? With this in mind, and to this end, my positive play scale colleagues and I recently developed what we are calling the positive play quiz that not only provides personal feedback related to the positive play scale, but also provides normative feedback. Okay, so players fill out the positive play scale as well as a couple of other measures, and they're given immediate feedback about how they're scoring. They're given positive play messages related to the 4 subscales, and they're told how their score relates to others. And this feedback has been tremendously positive. A few years back, also, I helped create and test a personalized feedback tool with Ontario Lottery and Gaming, a tool that we lovingly referred to as the win-loss tool. And again, this is a personal feedback tool where players are asked to indicate how much money they think they've won or lost at OLG slots and casinos over a 3-month period, and how many times they've visited a casino. And then they're given immediate feedback about what OLG's player data suggests. So they're given you see here that it's a number of visits. You told us that you visited 12 times. Well, according to our player data and your carded player data, you've actually visited us 20 times, right? You think that you've won $60, but according to our records, you've actually lost 204. And what we found here is when we tracked players over the course of over the course of time, that the relative difference between how much they thought they had lost versus how much they were told that they'd actually lost down regulated their play. So if they thought that they had only lost, say, $100, but we say, hey, according to our records, you've lost 800, what we find is a decrease in play over time. And also, importantly, players in this study told them that they wanted this tool and they wanted to use this tool often because they found it very helpful to help regulate their play. Now, although some people do love these tools, a few years ago, I published a paper that I soon found, and I forwarded an idea that I soon found was somewhat controversial. And that is that perhaps what we should be doing is we need to increase the value that players see in these RG tools and programs. Currently, players don't tend to see value in them. We need to find ways to increase the value that they see in using the RG tools and digesting the RG messaging to improve positive play. And one of the things that I argued is that perhaps we need to reward players for being positive players. One of the pathways to problem gambling is the reinforcement schedule that's inherent to gambling games. Okay, the variable ratio reinforcement schedule. That is that players will eventually win. They'll eventually experience a win, but they've lost so many times in advance of that small win that the net effect is actually that they've lost, but they're reinforced to get that next win. Okay, and I asked the question, can our knowledge about what creates problems be leveraged to advance responsible gaming? Specifically, what I put forward is, why don't we, give players points for engaging, so loyalty program points for setting a limit, for adhering to a limit, for watching an educational video like the slot machines, what every player needs to know, for attending RG workshops and lectures, that doing so might end up leading players to use those tools more frequently, especially if we start seeing that doing so will perhaps change their frame of reference, will create added value in RG. Okay, the popularity of loyalty programs is especially evident in the gambling industry, and what just about every single operator has loyalty programs. And so what I'm suggesting is that perhaps players who are members of these loyalty programs, that they might be more apt to use these responsible gambling tools if they are rewarded. And so now I have a growing program of research showing that there is actually utility here. So in a paper that was recently published, and should anybody want any of the papers that I'm discussing, please do feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to send you the papers or to talk to you about this. What we did is we recruited members of a loyalty program and told them, hey, listen, shortly, a major chain in the United States is going to introduce a feature of their casino loyalty program, a feature that will allow players to set a money and or time limit. And the difference between the two conditions is that, one, they were simply told that this tool is going to be introduced. And on the other hand, the other participants were told, hey, you're going to be incentivized for doing so. You're going to earn loyalty points for setting and adhering to your limits. And the next slide, I'm going to have some data, some p-values, beta weights, all that kind of stuff. If that's not your bag, don't pay attention to the numbers, just listen to what I'm saying, and I'll walk you through the results. What we found is that those in the incentivized program condition expressed a greater willingness to use the RG tools. Okay, they said that they would be more willing to use these tools if they were incentivized to do so. And from an industry point of view, what we also found is that this had an association with increasing attitudinal loyalty to the operator. So people felt that they could trust the operator more. In part, what we were finding participants were thinking was, hey, if they're willing to give me loyalty points for adhering to my limit, they must really care about me. They're not just paying lip service to this RG stuff. Basically, the take-home message here, what I'm trying to get across is that we can't be afraid to be innovative in terms of how we present RG, okay? How we try to motivate players to use RG. Some of the best RG work has been the result of thinking outside of the box, but still grounded in theory and research. So, for example, another study that I see, I have a couple more minutes. I just want to tell you one other kind of positive play, innovative RG thing that I'm trying to put forward. When there's a hormone called ghrelin. Ghrelin is a hormone that it's called the hunger hormone. It tends to increase as we are hungry. Okay, it's what tells us to feed. Okay, it means that there's a high level of ghrelin. Okay, when this has a lot of adaptive features for humans, right? It's telling us that we need to feed. There's a lot of research showing that when ghrelin levels are high, that people are more likely to take risks, right? From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense, right? If you're back in the day, you'd want to grab the team together to go and take down that buffalo in order to eat, okay? Within the context of gambling, however, this increased risk when you are hungry might lead to some problems. And so we brought participants into the lab. Some of them, all of them, we told them, don't eat. We don't want you to eat breakfast. We're going to feed you when you come into the laboratory. Half of them we fed as soon as they came into the laboratory. Half of them we waited until after they played in my casino lab at Carleton University. And what we found is that players who were hungry, they were more likely to engage in risky betting. Okay, they were more likely to gamble in the face of continued loss. So an easy, positive message that perhaps we can send to players is feed yourself before you feed the machine. Okay. Listen, so let me conclude by offering some paths forward. The face of RG is changing. It's becoming more positive. We also know that there is a value in the responsible gambling, the RG tools and programs that exist. But this needs to be better translated to players. And my colleagues and I have been arguing for a number of years now that we need to adopt a more positive, healthy approach to RG. At the end of the day, though, I really encourage, if there's any industry folk out there or councils, that research needs to be conducted in partnership with academics, okay? So there needs to be a partnership between researchers and the industry to validate efforts, to conduct research, do pre and post assessments, and not just wait until a program has been developed. We need evidence-based research to really move the needle, to increase the percentage of players who will use the tools that we know are effective. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Michael. That was quite a provocative and interesting and informative talk, really based on a lot of your research and that of other people. So we're going to throw it open to questions. We have a few questions, and I have a question for you. I guess the first question I'll take, and that is, we know that problem gamblers are not a homogeneous group. They differ in terms of the types of games they play. They differ in terms of their gender. They differ in terms of their age. They differ in terms of ethnicity. So when you're looking at the positive play approach, does it work particularly well for a certain group or subgroup of problem gamblers?
You know what, I thank you so much for that, because that is what we're finding is so interesting when we use the positive play scale, is that it allows for player segmentation, right, within a jurisdiction. So when we do these positive play studies, we're also looking at, we collect demographic information, okay? And typically we find that there's no gender differences in positive play. But we are finding time and time again, there are almost always age differences, okay? Where the younger the player, the less positive the play, okay? And so what that's telling us is that perhaps some of these RG or positive play messaging, we need to be looking at perhaps segmenting messaging by age, right? And thinking about how can we message younger people in particular, since they tend to be the lowest in terms of their positive play. What are the messages that are going to resonate with that group, okay? And I'll underscore again, not simply our gut feeling about what will resonate with the younger population. This is where it's important to engage people like yourself, others in the field of gambling studies, to do the research necessary before you throw something out into the field. Because if the message misses the mark, it might be a long time before you can get them back in to be paying attention to the RG messaging.
Thank you, Michael. Certainly the incentives that you could provide, or the industry can provide for people to adhere to this, is really quite important. The other thing that we're starting to see in the industry is a stepwise, step-up program. So younger people have different limits than older people, which is also really important. So there's an interesting question. You talked about the program in Florida, actually, the 1-800 Admit It.
Admit It,
And
yeah.
so one of the questions here is, the new number for gambling across the US is 1-800 Gambler. And the question is, what are your thoughts on that number?
Yeah, you know what, I have been pondering that a bit. And this is, first of all, let me start by saying I'm really happy that there's one number that is going to be used across. That is a major step forward. So kudos. But I do worry, right, about how that's going to be interpreted. That we know that many gamblers don't perceive themselves as a gambler, right? And may we be, again, shooting ourselves in the foot by players who might want to reach out, don't, because they say, well, I'm not a gambler, right? I'm having some of these problems, but that's obviously for people with gambling problems. And I don't see myself as having a gambling problem, despite the fact that they're losing tons of money, right? That they might be having interpersonal problems because of their gambling. So this is where I would love for researchers to be incorporated at the beginning, right? So before you roll out 1-800-GAMBLER, let's do some work to see, is this going to be alienating, right? As opposed to let's change it to Gambler and see what happens, right? And doing it after the fact, because after the fact, it may be too late. It's going to be really hard, working tirelessly. Keith and others have worked tirelessly to get that one number, right? Well, they're not going to change the name, next year, right? Yeah.
So we've also, we've changed the name over the years from, pathological gambler to compulsive gambler to problem gambler, and now we have disordered gambler. My argument has always been the characteristics of that person are identical.
Yes.
The difference is how we call them. And really, do you think that calling someone a disordered gambler is more positive than calling them a pathological gambler, compulsive gambler, problem gambler?
My feeling is that everything becomes a pejorative over time. So, maybe 10 years down the road, we'll have to change it from disordered gambler, right? And now, we do need to be cognizant of how people are interpreting it. And there is sometimes utility with changing because things have become a pejorative, right? Where in terms of responsible gambling, my concern is more about the fact that the vast majority of players see RG as being the domain of the disordered gambler, problem gambler, whatever you would like to call that group of individuals. And the term responsible gambling might turn some people off, right? Because implied in it is that you're irresponsible, right? If you use these tools. Then there was the move to responsible gaming. Again, we need to be cognizant of what that might do. Are we really saying that this is just a game, right? And then how might that impact rates? So that's why we were looking at things like positive player, healthy player, because those tools and those initiatives are really, by and large, geared to the 99% of players to help keep them from developing a gambling disorder or problems related to gambling.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Michael. I just want you to know that you have many, many positive comments in the chat room about your presentation.
Thank you.
There's another question. Before we go to that question, maybe you could just give people your email address because people are really interested.
Sure, I'll put it. Do I have access to the chat? Yes, I do.
Yeah, that would be great. Perfect.
I'll also put
you.
in my Twitter handle, should you want to message me through there.
Oh, Elon Musk may knock you off of there.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah, I don't have a blue check, and I'm definitely not going to pay the $8.
Okay, so I guess the final question is that someone wrote that there's a bureau that provides feedback on tobacco and alcohol advertising. Do you think it would be useful to have one on gambling advertising?
Sorry, I didn't catch that first part. I was reading the chat.
There's a bureau, I'm not sure what the person was referring to, that provides feedback for tobacco and alcohol advertising. Should there be one for gambling advertising? There's no truth in gambling advertising standards in the United States. The lottery corporations are actually exempt from that because they're owned by the state. So do you think it would be wise to have some national organization that looks at gambling advertising?
I think that would be an interesting step forward, as long as there were experts in the field of gambling studies that were on the board. And I think this is one of the major bees in my bonnet, if we want to use that old phrase, is that often these the gambling advertisements, what happens is that a jurisdiction, there's some, they might read the gambling literature and then pass it over to a marketing firm. They're great. I can't put out a marketing campaign. I don't have those skills, but they don't have the expertise in the field of gambling studies, right? And they might be creating slogans, phrases, adverts for the casinos, but they don't know the field. They don't understand the terminologies that might actually be creating greater harm in the service of good, though, right? And so this is why I've been advocating, and I don't understand why there's not a better system in place where experts in the field of gambling studies, the industry councils, and marketing firms work together, right? At the moment, there's a lot of silence that, a council or an operator might come and talk to me. What do you think about X, Y, and Z? Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Go back to their unit, then go to a marketing firm, right? And then a marketing firm develops something, and then maybe they reach out to Jeff and say, hey, Jeff, what do you think about this ad campaign? Well, I've got some problems with it. Well, I'm sorry, it's too late. We've already spent $100,000 on this campaign.
Yeah, good point, Michael. I think it's really, really important. Although I do think that the gambling industry as a whole is becoming more receptive to talking to people like
Yes.
us, the
I agree.
researchers and the clinicians, and I think that's a positive step forward. When you look at gaming, and I'm talking about the video gaming aspect now, not talking about gambling as gaming, they're much more reluctant to talk to people like us. So again, I want to thank you on behalf of everyone for an excellent presentation. The work you're doing is incredible and very, very important. So on behalf of the Raschkowan Foundation, the NCPG, and our center, thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you, and thank you for everybody who attended. Thank you for your time listening to me. Everyone, be well.
You too, Michael.
Bye-bye.